Thank you so much, Brenda. And I have the pleasure of introducing the speakers for our final session. So our first speaker this afternoon will be Cara Alfaro with a presentation on FDA's Good Clinical Practice Compliance Review for NDAs and BLAs. She'll be followed by Michelle Anantha, who will speak on the Clinical Investigator Inspection Readiness. And then finally, we'll have a presentation by Emily Jebbia, who will share with us information on FDA's use of alternative approaches to evaluate GCP compliance. With that, I will hand it over to Cara for the first presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. You know, I wish this class would have been offered when I was a clinical investigator. Fast forward 30 years, and here I am presenting in such a course, but from the regulatory perspective. I'd like to thank the course coordinators for providing me with this opportunity, and I hope that this presentation on FDA's Good Clinical Practice Compliance Review will be informative and maybe even a little illuminating. So in this presentation, I'll provide a very brief overview of FDA's Bioresearch Monitoring Program. I'll discuss the Good Clinical Practice Inspection process and the role of the Office of Scientific Investigations in the GCP review process. And I'll also share a case example from a clinical investigator inspection in which there were potential data reliability findings. So FDA's Bioresearch Monitoring Program is a comprehensive program of on-site inspections and data audits designed to monitor all aspects of the conduct and reporting of FDA-regulated research. Our objectives to ensure that the rights and welfare of human research participants are protected, to verify the quality and integrity of research data, and to ensure that FDA-regulated research is conducted in compliance with applicable regulations. Now, we conduct over 1,500 domestic and foreign inspections annually that involve different compliance programs, and I have not listed all of them all here, but I've given some examples, and they include GCP inspections, which I'll speak more about in this presentation, GLP inspections, in vivo bioavailability and bioequivalence studies, institutional review board inspections, and paid and REMS inspections. And the Office of Scientific Investigations coordinates inspections for many of these compliance programs. So how are we organized, you may ask? Well, we have an office director, and we have two divisions, a division of enforcement and post-marketing safety, and the division of clinical compliance evaluation. Under the first division, we have two branches, the Compliance Enforcement Branch, and they're responsible for enforcement actions, and I know that you'll be hearing more about that in other presentations. The Post-Marketing Safety Branch, and they coordinate REMS and paid inspections. And under the Division of Clinical Compliance Evaluation, we also have two branches, the GCP Compliance Oversight Branch, and they coordinate inspections for complaints, and also IRB surveillance inspections. And then we have the GCP Assessment Branch, and they coordinate inspections for NDA and BLA submissions. And I'll be focusing most of my talk on from the perspective of the assessment branch, since that's where I reside. So we'll be talking mostly about inspections that are for NDA and BLA submissions. So what is good clinical practice when we talk about these types of inspections? Dr. Ayalu mentioned GCP in his presentation, but the definition is a standard for the planning, initiating, performing, recording, oversight, evaluation, analysis, and reporting of clinical trials that provides assurance that the data and reported results are reliable and that the rights, safety, and well-being of trial participants are protected. And this definition actually comes from the International Council for Harmonization, E6R3, which is draft. It's not finalized yet, but that's their language, and it's consistent with FDA's current thinking on GCP. So when we talk about GCP inspections, what types of inspections are we talking about? Well, these primarily involve clinical investigators, sponsors, sponsor investigators, or contract research organizations. And again, because of the audience here, I'll be focusing most of my comments and examples on clinical investigator inspections. But please keep in mind that we do a host of other GCP inspections. So in fiscal 2023, and again, this data is for the assessment branch only. This is not all GCP inspections across FDA. So we conducted over 400 foreign and domestic GCP inspections. And as you can see, the vast majority were clinical investigator inspections, 82%. That shouldn't be a surprise because obviously there are more clinical investigators than there are CROs or sponsors. But we also do a fair share of sponsor and CRO inspections. It may be a surprise to you all, the GCP inspections are actually not required as part of the application review process. But they are usually requested by a review division for new molecular entities and for efficacy supplements, especially if there is new dosing that could in fact potentially increase safety risks, for example, a new population, for example, a more vulnerable population such as a pediatric population, or a new indication that might be very different. Inspections may also be requested if there are lots of major protocol deviations in an application that merit follow-up, serious adverse events, or even issues related to maintaining the integrity of a blind, for example. So these are other factors where a review division could consult us and set up inspections for clinical investigators or sponsors or CROs. So I'd like to take a few moments to go over the GCP inspection process, and I'll be focusing most of my discussion in the next few slides on how we select sites for inspection, but I would like to give you an overview of the entire process, and then I'll comment specifically in future slides on some aspects of this process. So first we do select sites, and again, in future slides I will go into more detail about that. OSI then issues an inspection assignment to OII, and that's the Office of Inspections and Investigations. And this was formerly ORA, so we just changed things to confuse everyone, including ourselves. I'll be calling it ORA for a while until I get used to it, but now it's OII. And then the BIMO investigator for OII conducts the inspection. The BIMO investigator provides an establishment inspection report, which is called an EIR, and they recommend an initial classification. And again, I'll go through what those classifications are in future slides. OSI determines the final classification based on a review of that EIR, that report, evidence, and any response that may have been submitted from the clinical investigator or inspected entity. And then OSI communicates the inspection outcome to the inspected entity. But as I mentioned, I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about how do we choose the sites that are going to be selected. And really another name for that is, how did you become the very lucky one? So when we're looking at what potential sites may be inspected, we work very closely with the review division and statisticians. We use a clinical investigator site selection tool that assists us in the site selection process. And the next slide will go over more details about that tool. This tool, the data from this tool, is generated from data submitted by sponsors. And if you want to know, it's called a clinsite.xpt file, and also OSI internal metrics. And this is a web-based site selection tool that was developed by FDA to assist in this process. So this gives you sort of a snapshot of what the tool actually looks like. This tool ranks site risk using an algorithm based on site attributes, some of which I've listed here. So these include things such as enrollment, efficacy outcome, complaints, numbers of SAEs, numbers of protocol deviations, and time since last inspection. So the tool will actually risk rank the site based on these attributes, and you can also look individually at how that site compares with the average of all sites in the application. Now the results of this tool, this risk ranking, it's really just a starting point for discussions about site selection. We look more granularly at such things as complaints, for example, to see if a specific complaint was significant and relevant to the current application. So we don't just take, the first 5 sites that show up on this tool and just that's where we go. It's not as simple as that. Of course it's not. So we do look more granularly at some of these attributes to see how significant they may be when determining what site to actually inspect. But there are also that we look at that are not captured in this tool. One of those would be the significance of protocol deviations, for example. The site selection tool will risk rank sites based on numbers of protocol deviations, and usually it's divided into important and non-important protocol deviations. So here I'm speaking more about the important protocol deviations since we would likely focus on that. But we look at the types of protocol deviations, not just the overall number. We have to then go into the data line listings that are submitted by the sponsor to get an idea about the description of the protocol deviation and how significant it might be. So that's more of a granular level, not just looking at the number. However, we also consider that sites with very low or zero important protocol deviations could also be problematic from an underreporting perspective. So, it's never as simple as it seems. We actually do a lot of thinking about these attributes as we're going through this process of selecting sites. We also look at individual site impact on efficacy variables. Now, the previous slide did say that efficacy outcome was one of the attributes, and that's true. And you can look at the efficacy at a particular site, and you can look at how it compares to the overall average or mean. But the tool does not do a statistical analysis where it drops a site and sees what happens to the p-value, for example. And that's what statisticians will do for us. So we're in very close communication with statisticians, and they do those various analyses. And that helps us to look at the impact of an individual site. And if there is a particular site that drives efficacy or is very impactful on a p-value, then it's very likely we would go to that site for data verification for efficacy data. But again, the tool does not do that analysis for us. We may also look at GCP issues that were raised by the sponsor. For example, perhaps they did various sensitivity analyses, and we would want to know why a particular site was excluded, for example, and maybe we would go to that site and verify data on which the exclusion was based. Also, if there was a site terminated due to GCP issues, we may want to go to that site. And sometimes we look at unblinding that is not captured as a protocol deviation necessarily. It may be somewhere else in the application. So we spend a lot of time looking very closely all through the application for different things that may help us to determine or make a very good decision on where we want to spend our resources as far as site selection for inspections. So sometimes unblinding could be captured in a clinical study report. It could be in some other data set somewhere. So again, we look to try to find if there are other issues that are recorded elsewhere and not captured in protocol deviations. And that does assist us with making that decision about inspections. So after we've identified the sites for inspection, as I mentioned, OSI will issue an inspection to OII and they will conduct the inspection. So on average, we choose about 2 to 3 clinical sites per protocol chosen for the inspection. And by protocol, usually it's phase 3 trials, sometimes it's phase 2 trials. It just depends. Sometimes we choose more than 3 sites. We usually don't choose less than 2. So on average it's 2 to 3, but again, there's a lot of wiggle room there. And it really depends on, the particular protocol, how much, how high the enrollment numbers are, et cetera. So there's lots of things that go into that, but I say on average 2 to 3, which seems like a very few number of sites. If you look at the, how many sites are usually enroll in clinical trials, especially phase 3 studies. So it is a small snapshot. It is only usually 2 to 3. And what are we looking at with clinical trial conduct? Well, we're looking to see whether the study was conducted according to protocol. And usually we're looking at things such as eligibility criteria, perhaps blinding procedures, administration of investigational product, for example. Does the study conduct comply with federal regulations? And by that I mean IRB approvals, consent procedures, financial disclosure, things of that nature. We also do data verification during inspections. And we do data verification for primary and secondary efficacy data, and sometimes exploratory, for example, rare diseases. But we work very closely with the review division because they are the ones that are letting us know what data they would like verified that helps with their regulatory decision making. So we work very closely with the review division to look at what data they would like us to verify. We also look at adverse events and primarily looking for unreported or underreported adverse events and protocol deviations. So OSI, we are in communication with OII before, during, and after the inspection. We just don't wait at the end for the report and then look at it and go on our merry way. We actually are communicating in real time prior to, during, and after the inspection. And this is really helpful because, as I mentioned, we pick 2 to 3, maybe more clinical sites. So we may have inspections ongoing at different time frames. So if we're communicating with OII for an ongoing or completed inspection and they're finding something that perhaps we hadn't anticipated, then that may help us to inform pending inspections and add that to the assignment. Oh, please look at this because this at this particular site, this was found. So that really is very helpful and very efficient for our inspection process to get that feedback in real time. And OSI may participate in an inspection as a subject matter expert. So review divisions do consult OSI to request inspections, as I mentioned, and inspections are not mandatory. But we do work very closely with the review division during the entire NDA BLA review process. We actively participate in important milestone meetings. And we communicate to the review division inspection findings in real time. Again, we're not waiting until the end till we have all the reports, and the PDUFA date is just about to loom and an action is going to be taken. That's not the time that we're going to be telling them about what inspection findings happened during inspection. So we do communicate with the review division in real time. And some examples might be if we're finding trends in, maintenance of a study blind, if there's unblinding issues, if there are underreporting of significant adverse events or serious adverse events. We may want to follow up on data anomalies that were identified by the review division. So again, the sooner we get that information to them, definitely it impacts statistical analyses, which are ongoing during the entire review cycle. So the sooner we can communicate any issues with them, the better. And depending on the inspection findings, we could add additional clinical investigator sites to be inspected. If there happens to be an issue that we want to make sure is it a pervasive issue across all sites, or is it limited to this particular clinical investigator site? So we could add additional sites if we have the time in the review clock to do so. We could add sponsor or CRO inspections if they weren't already scheduled to occur. And more often than not, this generates many information requests to the sponsor to clarify certain data or information that were found on inspections. And it may be that the sponsor, upon receiving information requests, may be contacting you, the clinical investigator, to help them to respond to these requests from the FDA. So the last part of this review process, the investigator provides that final written report, and we pretty much sort of should know what's going to be in the report because, as I mentioned, we've been talking to them. OSI and OII talk to each other, but we do get the finalized report, and that'll include whatever exhibits, and attachments that they have that support whatever they may have found during the inspection. They recommend an initial classification, and we determine the final classification based on that report. Again, exhibits or evidence and whatever response you may have provided. And then we communicate the outcome to the inspected entity, or in this case, the clinical investigator. So I know Dr. Nantha will be speaking in more detail about these compliance classifications during her presentation, but I did want to go over them in a very high level. So there's basically 3 compliance classifications. The first is NAI, no action indicated, and that's if there were no objectionable conditions or practices. The second is VAI, or voluntary action indicated. So there were objectionable conditions or practices noted during the inspection, but it was not at a threshold to take or recommend administrative or regulatory action. And then the one that you really don't want, that's OAI, official action indicated. And these are serious or objectionable conditions that were found and regulatory action was recommended. Now, while I'm on this slide, I wanted to say that for inspections in which OII recommends a VAI or OAI classification, a Form FDA 483 would have been issued at the conclusion of that inspection. There have been cases in which no 483 was issued and the clinical investigator received a VAI letter. And that's what we call it. It's like, you're not going to get a letter that says VAI on it. It just says objectionable conditions or practices were noted. And the clinical investigator is a little bit surprised. What happened? I didn't get a 483. Why do I have this letter? What's going on? Well, if you remember back to that GCP process, OSI actually determines the final classification, not OII. So when OSI reviews that establishment inspection report, they may sometimes determine that there were objectionable findings. Now, many times those were noted as items that were discussed with the investigator, but did not become an item for a 483. So you may already have a clue as to what that may have been. But the objectionable letter will usually reference the finding since you didn't receive a 483 that referenced the finding. So just in case you're ever in that situation, that's what happened. And we call that at FDA, we say we're upgrading the inspection. So we're upgrading the recommendation. But that's what happened behind the scenes in case you're ever surprised and wanted to know how that could have possibly happened. So that's the scenario. And it doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen. So actually I'd like to share a case example that will illustrate potential data integrity findings and sort of what do we do with that information and how do we relay that to the review. So this is a randomized double-blind phase 3 study. The primary endpoint was the change in a rating scale administered by an examining physician. There were 10 different domains assessed, each scored 0 to 6 based on severity. The examining physician was to enter the electronic clinical outcome assessment, or ECOA ratings, into an e-device during the assessment. Per protocol, ECOA ratings were to be performed prior to a 3-hour investigational product, or IP, IV infusion. In case of e-device malfunction, a paper backup process was in place. And this gives a schematic, an illustration of how that process looks. The participant is assessed. The examining physician inputs the data in real time into the e-device, and then the investigational product is administered over 3 hours. Now, during the inspection, we found that IP was administered over 3 hours for 2 subjects or 2 participants. There was an overlap in the administration, which is fine if you have the study staff to do that. That's not a problem. And when we looked at data entry into the e-device, the audit trails revealed that the start time stamps on the e-device indicated that the data were entered sometime after the infusion. And if you note, they were supposed to be entered in real time before. Not only that, but in this particular case, and this will become relevant in another slide or two, the data were entered for 2 separate subjects within about 7 minutes of each other. So the ECOA data were entered after rather than prior to the 3-hour IP infusion. So we had to ask ourselves, when was the assessment actually performed? The examining physician stated that the assessment was completed prior to the infusion, but there was really no documentation to support that. There was no e-device malfunction and no paper source. The clinical investigators stated that data was entered based on examining physician recall. But if you remember, the ECOA involved 10 different domains, each scored 0 to 6 based on severity. So we had to question the ability of this physician to recall all ratings for 2 or more subjects to record in an e-device 3 hours or later after the assessment was completed. Particular case, the examining physician also entered data into the e-device using different physicians' username and login credentials. And that became an issue when we're trying to figure out attribution of the data, who actually did the assessment. For this particular protocol, it was important that the examining physician was to be blinded with no access to subject data. So if the credentials that were used were for a physician that actually had access to this data, then we'd have to be concerned about the maintenance of the study blind in this particular case, since we just don't have correct attribution, at least documentation of correct. So for this inspection, it was classified as VAI based on failure to adhere to the protocol and inadequate and/or inaccurate records. The impact on data reliability, we assessed that it was significant, and we recommended to the review division that they conduct a sensitivity analysis. And really, there are responsibilities of the CI and the sponsor with regard to these sorts of issues. The importance of contemporaneous data entry needs to be discussed with the people that are doing the assessments. And really, not sharing login credentials, which sounds pretty basic, but you'd be surprised how often we actually run across that issue. So we have to know, attribution of data. So I do have a few challenge questions. The first one, when choosing CI sites for inspection, which of the following are not usually considered? A, enrollment. B, number of sub-investigators. C, protocol deviations. Or D, impact on efficacy variables. And the answer is number of sub-investigators. Question, which FDA office conducts GCP inspections? Is it A, OND, Office of New Drugs, B, OSE, Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology, C, OII, Office of Inspections and Investigations, or D, OSI, Office of Scientific Investigations? And the answer is OII, Office of Inspections and Investigations. And this wasn't really meant to be a trick question. OSI can participate in inspections as subject matter experts, but it's really OII who are responsible for conducting GCP inspections. So in summary, the goal of GCP inspections is to provide assurance that the data are reliable and that the rights of trial participants are protected. For NDA and BLA submissions, OSI collaborates with review divisions to choose sites for CI inspections. And OSI communicates inspection findings to the review division throughout the NDA BLA review cycle and provides recommendations regarding data integrity. So I want to thank you very much for your attention. I'll be joining the panel at the end of the day to answer any questions you may have. Our next speaker is Dr. Michelle Anantha, and I've worked with her since I joined OSI almost 10 years ago. Time flies. Dr. Anantha will be discussing clinical investigator inspection readiness. Thank you again.